Hello everybody, today we're taking a look at the Hobbymate Flash 215mm race drone kit. So first let's see what you get in the kit. You get the frame itself, features 6mm arms. The top and bottom plates are 2mm thick. You have a 3D printed camera mount and antenna mount. You have the motors, which are 2207, 2250 kV. See, they have very nice windings. And then they have a shield here to keep the wires out of the motor bell, and they have the hex nut on the bottom. You get an Airbot Omnibus F4 V6 flight controller. Has 5 UARTs. A Furling 32 4-in-1 ESC. This is rated from 3 to 6S, and it's rated up to 45 amps continuous and a peak of 55 amps. You get the Hobbymate branded VTX, anywhere from 0 milliwatts up to 600 milliwatts. Also has solder pads on the back if you don't end up wanting to use a cable. It comes with a linear dipole, but Hobbymate also supplies a Foxeer Lollipop 3 antenna, right hand circular polarized with an MMCX connector. You get the Hobbymate branded FrSky compatible D16 receiver. This features full telemetry just like the FrSky RXSR. You get a battery pad, Hobbymate branded strap. The camera is a Caddx Turbo Micro SDR2 Plus Race Edition with the Turbo Eye lens. For the ESC, you get two 35 volt 470 microfarad capacitors, and also a piece of RF shield. You get all the hardware you need. You have the standoffs for the frame kit. You have the motor hardware, the bolts for that. There are also O-rings in here for the flight controller. So everything you need hardware-wise. Also in the kit, you get the data sheets for the flight controller and for the ESC. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start assembling this kit. I'm going to start off with the frame. Here's the assembly diagram. So I'll get that put together and I'll be right back. All right, here we are with the finished frame. There's the top. There's the front with the camera mount. Here's the back with the FPV antenna mount. And some holes down here to mount your receiver wires through. There's the bottom. Everything's nicely recessed. All hardened steel bolts. And then we have the bolts for the stack up. Went ahead and put on some standoffs here at the bottom to hold those in there tight. All right, so now I'll go ahead and install the motors and ESC. Okay, I've got the motors and ESC installed. Here's a closer look. I got the foil tape on top of the ESC. I trimmed it just a hair. I got both capacitors installed, which is recommended if you're going to be flying on 6S, which I'm going to. Pay attention, there's a negative on the capacitors. You want to make sure they're both wired to the negative terminal and the other side is wired to the positive terminal. The motors, use just 3 bolts. Use the longer of the 2 screws provided. Again, these are the thicker 6mm arms. Next, I'm going to install the flight controller and the receiver. I'll go ahead and put a wiring diagram on the screen now so you can see what those look like. Okay, so I've got the flight controller all wired up now. If we start off with the receiver, wire the voltage lead to this constant 5 volts here. This is 5 volts just when the USB is plugged in, or includes when the USB is plugged in. So that's handy for setting up in Betaflight. I've got the S-Bus pad wired up here next to it. That's the white wire, and the S-Port pad here. Then ground is here. So moving on to the camera. So here's the camera lead. This is the lead that came with the camera, and it's got the little pigtail here for the OSD. So I've got it wired up to the positive 8 volts pad here, and ground and video in. It's kind of hard to see there, but you'll see it on the wiring diagram. And so this is the lead that goes to the VTX. Again, it's being powered by the same 8 volts, ground and video out. Now, this is the lead. They came with the VTX, like I said, but I took out 2 of the wires. There's 2 wires that supply 5 volts and ground to the camera that you could, but I wanted to use it coming straight off the board. And then, so that's that for that. And I always put a twist in the camera and the video wires. This helps cut down on video noise. So then moving on to the ESC. So one thing you want to double check on is that you have this connector wire plugged in right. Should be fairly obvious, but you want to have ground on this side of the ESC, and then battery voltage. And then this wire here, this is a longer lead that will be in the connector here. That's another good indication that you've got it plugged in the ESC right. It may not always be blue, but this is your current readout from your current meter on your ESC, and that goes over to the current pad here on the flight controller. And so this next wire is telemetry, and then the rest of these are the motor signals. So you just plug this into here. And then you have 5 volts, telemetry, ground, and then there's nothing. And then there's the motor signals. You want to make sure this is right, because if for some reason this is wrong, it can burn up your flight controller. All right, so I think that's everything. So now I'll go ahead. Well, one other thing really. This little pigtail here, like I mentioned, it goes to the OSD, but you'll want to turn off the built-in OSD on your camera, because it'll normally read out voltage and timers, and so you'll typically want Betaflight to do that for you. So that's pretty much it. So now I'll go ahead and install the camera and the VTX. And other thing I did do, I went ahead and used a heavy zip tie here and zip tied the battery lead to one of the arms. That's in case, if you get in a wreck and eject the battery, that it doesn't pull off your ESC. And then I put some heat shrink around these capacitors. All right, so that's it. So I'll go ahead and get those last pieces installed, and I'll be right back. So I went ahead and completed the drone. I've got the camera installed up front here. I've got the receiver underneath the VTX. There's a little piece of double-sided sticky tape, taping it down to the flight controller. Got the VTX, the connectors up front. Got the antenna installed. Of course, the connectors in the back. went ahead and put the tubes on the antennas for the receiver. So next we'll go to Betaflight and I'll show you the configuration.
All right, here we are ready to configure the drone. You want to make sure you have 3 things ready to go. First of all, you want to have the latest Betaflight. At the time of this video, it's configurator 10.6.0. And then you want to have the latest BL Heli Suite 32. Latest version is 32.7.0.4. And to make things easy, you want to download the Hobbymate configuration file for Betaflight 4.1. So, first of all, what we should do is go ahead and update our ESCs. So we're going to be flashing Betaflight 4.1 to the board. The board may come with Betaflight 4.1, in which case you wouldn't need to do this, but at the time of this video, the board comes with Betaflight 4.0. So in order to be able to take advantage of all the features in Betaflight 4.1, we need the latest ESC firmware. So what you're going to do is go ahead and plug in your USB cord to your drone. Computer should recognize it. You see it here in Betaflight. And then we're going to plug in a battery to your drone. No propellers, please. Okay, so then what we're going to do is we're going to hit read setup. And I've already flashed the latest version of the firmware to the ESCs, but I'll show you how to do one of them. So what you would do, the way I do it, is I just deselect everything. I hit flash firmware. It brings up the latest version. I'll go ahead and select it again. And it's pretty much came up with a warning that says I've already got the latest firmware, but I'll go ahead and flash it anyway. So it's flashing it. All right, so it's complete. And it says, do I want to write the current settings to the ESC? The answer is yes. All right, now it's done with the first ESC. Now what I would do is select the next ESC and repeat that process. And I'm not going to do that, but you'll need to do that for each one of the 4 ESCs. All right, so now we are done with BL Heli Suite. You can close it out. You can now unplug your battery. So now we're going to flash Betaflight 4.1 firmware to the flight controller. So I like to go ahead and close out Betaflight and then disconnect it from the USB. I press down the bootloader button on the flight controller. Plug back in the USB. Open up Betaflight. And you'll see now that it's in DFU mode. Then you go to Update Firmware. You want to select the Omnibus F4 V6 AirBot. Latest firmware at the time of this video is 4.1.0. You want to click Load Firmware Online, and then Flash Firmware. All right, now it's done, and we can connect to the flight controller in Betaflight, and it's going to come up with this message that if we want to apply custom defaults, and we do. We'll connect again. All right, so now you can move your drone around, and you should see it move correctly within Betaflight. So now we need to configure it. So the easiest thing to do is to have this Betaflight configuration file downloaded from the Hobbymate website, and you can select all of this, copy it, go to the CLI, right click in this little box, hit paste, press enter, and you'll see all of the configurations being applied. automatically reboots. Hit connect, and everything should have been applied. So I'm going to assume now that you've already bound your receiver to your transmitter. So let's go through each one of the tabs. So on the ports, we're using UART2 for the VTX. It's IRC tramp protocol. And then for the ESC telemetry, we're using UART4, selected here. And lastly, for the FR Sky receiver, we're using UART6 for the serial RX. Configuration. For Betaflight 4.1, I've essentially applied the configuration that Joshua Bardwell recommended. In the upper right-hand corner, I'll provide a link to where he describes that in great detail. Does a really good job. So going down through here, pretty much defaults. We have the ESC sensor because we're using ESC telemetry. We have this selected. We have bidirectional D-shot. This is a new feature, and one of the reasons we updated the firmware on our ESCs was to take advantage of this. So we move down through here. These flight controllers do have a barometer on them, so you'll see that it's selected here and it's active up here at the top. And if we move down through here, we are using an FR Sky receiver, so we have serial-based receiver and S-bus selected. And we have OSD, anti-gravity, and dynamic filtering. I do not have air mode selected. I do select air mode via a switch in the mode setup. And we have the D-shot beacon setup. But that is it on this page. Nothing. These are defaults on the power and battery tab. I'm going to go ahead and enable expert mode here. So next is PID tuning. These are automatically set up per Joshua Bardwell's recommendations. And most of the change is down here in the dynamic notch filters settings. Then we have receiver here. I'm assume, like I said a few minutes ago, I'm assuming you go ahead and have your receiver already bound. And if it's connected properly, you should be able to get all the right movement on the sticks here. If it's out of order, you can change it here on the channel map. You can change it to the correct order for your receiver and your transmitter, and just make sure you hit save at the end of it. And right here on aux4, I have my transmitter set up so that gets transmitted back on aux4, so for the RSSI. And then modes, I have ARM set up on switch 1. Now you can change this based on your configuration, but this works out well for mine. So we have ARM set up on aux1. I have flight modes set up on aux2 as a 3-way switch. So I have angle, horizon, and then I apply air mode for both horizon and acro mode. And then on aux3, it's a 3-position switch. The middle position is the beeper, and the bottom switch is the flip over after crash. And then lastly, we go to the motors tab. And so if you have everything set up right, with your ESC D-shot configuration or firmware update, you'll see these values here. So here we can go ahead and plug the battery back in. Again, no props. So we can go ahead and flip this switch here, and what we want to do here is make sure that each one of our motors are turning in the correct direction. And you can see here it's showing the RPM and the temperature, and so you just want to make sure that your motors are turning the directions as shown on the diagram here. If they are not, go ahead and note which ones they are, and then we'll have to go back over into BL Heli Suite to change those. We'll do that in a moment. And then here's the OSD pre-configured. You can move these around if you want, and you can also select different elements, but these are the ones that come configured from Hobbymate. And also, as part of the configuration file, one of the changes in Betaflight 4.1 is that it requires that the user ends up putting in their own VTX tables. So this VTX table was applied during the configuration, which is appropriate for the Hobbymate branded VTX that's supplied with this kit. So that's all ready to go. And that's pretty much it. So if you needed to end up switching any of your motor directions, you would do that in BO HeliSuite. And all you have to do, again, this is still with your battery, we need to disconnect out of Betaflight. But what you would do is you would hit read setup, and then you would change one of the directions. So let's say I wanted to, I determined that I need to change ESC number 1. I would just simply change it to the opposite direction, and then hit write setup, and it would write that. Now I'll go ahead and switch that back real quick because I have it set already correctly. So we disconnect out of that. And that is it. We are set up and ready to go take it out for a test flight.
All right, I've got props on now. I got the Dow Cyclone T5050C props, and you'll notice I put a GPS on this. You just essentially wire this into one of the UARTs. I use UART 3, supply 5 volts and ground, and that's it, and configure in Betaflight. So we'll see how fast this is on 6S. This is an R-Line 95C 1300 milliamp hour pack. All right, off to the field.